Alright, painting friends, it's Stoof here. I am back with a finished painting and part 4 of 4 painting tutorial for this guy right here. This was inspired by Acadia National Park. So to get started with part 4, I quickly just went over the sky again with similar colors that I already had, just warming the colors up slightly. But really just wanted to get another coat of paint on there because I could see a little bit of white through the thinned down oil paint first layer I put down, so I just thickened that up a bit. So if your layer already looked good, then you can pass up on that. Here I realized that Bar Island was too tall, so I adjusted that island and made it a little bit shorter and adjusted the shape a bit there. Also adjusted the color in the water, giving a bit more of a reflection, like that blue reflection under the island that you can see. Also touched up just a little bit, brightening up that background to push it even farther into the distance. And these are all things that I was working on in parts 1 through 3, but here I'm just further refining these again, adjusting the colors and the values just to make them read a little bit more accurately. Here I'm starting to work on the part that I was dreading to do, which was adding all the little buildings in the town of Bar Harbor. And this ended up being much more simple than I expected it to be. What I did for adding these little buildings is I didn't perfectly follow my reference photo as to where each building should go on what street and all that, because you can't really tell when it's this far into the distance. It's not the main focus of the piece. So what I did is I just took my small flat-tipped brush and I would take some beige, like some burnt sienna with white and maybe a hint of yellow, a hint of flesh tint, just get like a beige color, and just put a couple little squares, rectangles, scattered, starting with the farthest bits in the back of the town and kind of making my way forward with these little shapes for buildings. Then just kind of sporadically putting in that color and then making a few that were gray, so like white with a hint of ultramarine blue and a hint of black, just so it's not a pure white, and adding a couple little rectangles there for those just to imply some buildings there. What other colors? We had some that were more like just burnt sienna, like a brick color. So yeah, I just kind of started to add those little buildings all over the place. Here I'm also adding highlights for the tops of the trees, and that was helping me to figure out where I should put buildings. So I kind of worked with both of these at the same time. So I'll add a few buildings, then I'll start to further refine where my trees are going, and then add a few more buildings. Okay, I think some more tree highlights can go here. So kind of play around with it, and you'll see it start to take form as you keep adding more highlights for your trees, maybe a few more shadows too, and then these shapes for the buildings. It just starts to kind of read realistically once you keep building up more and more layers here. You also want to pay attention to the size of your buildings. So the distance here is pretty far. So we're way up on Cadillac Mountain, looking so far out into this little town of Bar Harbor. And that island behind it is, we do a mile walk on that island. So that Bar Island, long island on the left, just behind the little village here, is at least a mile long. So that gives you an idea of, and it's probably a half mile, and maybe like a quarter mile or a tenth of a mile even to that island. It's not that far. So that tells you how big those buildings should be. They should be very tiny. We're also going to have some boats in the marina area, harbor area, and those are going to be pretty small as well. So going back to our highlights on the trees here, we worked on this in parts 1, 2, and 3, I believe, and I'm just continuing to refine my highlights. I'm using a variety of greens here. We don't want to get too crazy with the yellows yet because we're still kind of far in the distance, but there is some cadmium yellow light mixed with phthalo green and a couple other little colors in there too, just to make it a little bit more natural. So there is some yellow in there. Just make sure yellow isn't like the main color in your highlights at this distance. And if you can see how I'm moving the brush, I'm just making like little humps, like upside down U shapes, to create these little highlights and kind of carrying it back for each little row of trees. We have some trees and we have some field area, so it's not completely forested back here on the right side of the canvas, but on the left side it is pretty forested. And this section here also isn't too yellow because it's not fully lit up by the sun either. The hillside coming closer to the foreground where we see that ridge that's yellow, that is being lit up by the sun. The foreground is starting to get lit up by the sun, but that section near Bar Harbor is still our cooler greens because we have light there, but it's not bright sunlight, morning glow touching those trees. And when you're working on your field versus your trees, you want to use different greens for that so they stand out from one another, and the way that you do your brush stroke is also going to make these sections stand out from one another. So here you can see I'm using a little bit more yellow ochre in there, and it does look like I'm using more yellow in general for the field areas, and then for the tree areas we're using our cooler greens. With this ridge on the left, we're jumping closer and closer to the foreground. We're starting to get more saturation in our color, and we're starting to get more yellows and oranges and reds starting to pop up. So here for the shadows, we don't want to go too dark yet, and that has been something I was struggling with in this painting. So I keep going back and lightening up the shadows. You'll notice, if you haven't noticed that yet in the first few parts of this, but you'll be able to tell if your shadows are too dark if they're matching the colors of the shadows in the foreground. So your pine trees right here in the foreground, if they are blending in too much with that hillside behind it, then you need to lighten your shadows and make them less saturated than what you have in the foreground, and that will help push it farther back into the distance. And the tricky thing with this painting is that that hillside still has to be darker and more saturated than the area behind it, and then you just have to keep getting less saturated and less contrast as you push farther back into the painting. So that's one of the challenges with a painting that has a very clear foreground, middle ground, and background, and these all kind of lead and flow into each other as well. It's not just like a harsh separation between them. So that could be tricky for you in this painting, but the way that you can work on that is just by starting with things farthest in the background, adjusting that light value, and then moving forward and just making sure that, as you're moving forward, you're getting more contrast and you're getting darker shadows as you're getting closer to the foreground. So back to this hillside here, we have super bright highlight right here where the light is just hitting this hillside. We have some autumn trees in there as well, so there are hints of orange that start to pop up. So mostly I'm using cadmium yellow light and some Indian yellow to warm up that yellow a bit. Bits of white in there, maybe a hint of cadmium yellow medium as well to warm up that yellow in some spots. And there is a hint of phthalo green that was just on the brush too there, so it's not perfectly yellow yet. We still have a little bit of cooler green in that yellow. And as we're going down the hillside, We can start to get to the point where the sunlight is no longer touching and our light ridge of the hillside turns a cool light green and no longer is that bright golden yellow. So here you see me continuing to work in this area and pushing a little farther back into the background, coming a little closer into the foreground, just trying to get all of my highlights in for these little tops of the trees and try to keep the colors consistent where I'm not making them all washed out because I'm not using the same colors. For some of these little clusters of trees, you want to incorporate some magenta and some brown in there, not just like your phthalo green and your sap green. You want to get some other colors mixed in there as well to mute the greens down in some spots and make the greens more vibrant in other spots. It's also an autumn scene, so if you would like to push this color even farther, you could use more browns, purples, and reds and oranges in here as well that start to become more vibrant as they get closer to the foreground. I worked on this section a lot in the last part of this, so it's really just repetitive of adding a highlight and a shadow. If you want some more tips on what colors I'm using, then I believe I go into more detail in that in part 3. But for here, it's just going to be repetitive, using the same colors basically, and just continuing to build up the highlights and try to define the shape of the hillside and where the clusters of trees go. Here I am starting to lighten up some of the highlights and some of the shadows on that ridge in the middle area on the left, and that is helping me to separate that from the foreground a bit more, and it's also giving me that nice cool highlight on the little tops of the trees back there on the shadow side. So our light source is on the far right out of the scene, but it's casting that light right on the right side of that hill slope. So the left side is going to be mostly in shadow. For your shadow colors here and your shadows on the shadow side, you want to use more phthalo blue, maybe some ultramarine blue as well, a little bit of purple too, and then some phthalo green as well. And then for your highlights on the shadow side, you want to use more phthalo green, maybe a little bit of ultramarine blue just to tone that down a bit, and some white, and a hint of a cool yellow. Nothing too crazy. You don't want to have warm yellows in your shadows. Even though it's a highlight, it's on the shadow side. So it's like you got a double shadow, then you got one shadow, and then you have a highlight on the right side. So for our highlights, we're using more of those warm yellows, and we're also starting to use some oranges in there too. Now I'm starting to push my way closer to the foreground, where we're using lots of yellow and oranges. So I'm using Indian yellow all over the place here because it's really warm yellow, especially when you add some white to it. Just is like the perfect color for a warm sunlit glow. So we're using that on these trees in the foreground. I just started moving back to the background there because I noticed that I didn't see enough separation in the highlights and shadows from the foreground and that hillside in the back left there. So I lightened up things one more time, and now I'm working on the foreground, adding my shadows first and then coming in with a highlight on top of that. This is oil paint, so I'm getting a little bit of wet on wet paint here. If you want to let your shadows dry, then you can add your highlight on top of that, and your highlight will be way brighter and it won't blend in with your shadow at all. So what I did here is I added those highlights, and then it wasn't like as bright as I wanted it to be, so I slept overnight and came back, and that paint was a little bit more dry, so I could add a better highlight on it the next day. Also starting to use more just like straight up phthalo green with just a little bit of burnt sienna in it to make it a little bit more natural. The phthalo green that I just got is like super vibrant, but it's not a very natural color. So adding a brown to it kind of brings it a little bit more earthy, toned. Here I'm working on the rocks in the background, so our rocks also have a warm highlight and a cool shadow. Most of these rocks are gray, some of them are like a little bit of like a pinkish color from the feldspar in there, but in general these rocks are like a gray color, so they're picking up that warmth. The pinkish part of the rocks are picking up that warmth in the sunlight, and then the shadow is turning into like a phthalo blue with a hint of magenta, a hint of ultramarine blue, and it's a really nice transition of warm to cool on these rocks. And the rocks in the super front foreground have lots of green on them as well from the lichen, which we don't get to see for the rocks farther in the background. So I'm using my liner brush to define the little crevices in between those rocks in the background, using some of my shadow colors, so like ultramarine blue, burnt umber, a little bit of black. And here I'm starting to just jump around and add some vivid, warm colors. I love this cadmium red light that I have. It's like one of my, it's one of my favorite colors, honestly, now. Like, green was always my favorite color, but that cadmium red light is just like so attention grabbing. As soon as I put that paint on there, you're just like, you have to stare at that red paint because it just stands out so much, especially in this scene where everything is like a cool green and then it's like a bam, pop of a warm red. But anyway, back to the painting. Yes, I'm jumping around, adding lots of color here for the autumn scene. Now that we're in the foreground, we can really get those true, vibrant, warm colors and highlights and shadows. So basically, whenever you're doing a red plant, bush, tree, you want to have your cadmium red light for your highlight. Mix that in with a little bit of white, maybe a little bit of cadmium orange or cadmium yellow for that really bright highlight. And then for your shadows, you can use some magenta, some alizarin crimson, some burnt sienna, even like mix a little bit of phthalo blue in there too to really cool it down, but just a tiny bit. So that's the kind of colors you're looking for in your reds. In your orange plants, you want to use some cadmium orange, you want to use some siennas for like the undertones, add more yellow and white for your highlights. For your yellow plants, you want to use more cadmium yellow medium if it's like a warm yellow. If it's like a cooler yellow, then you could start by mixing some sap green with your cadmium yellow light, and then just go brighter and brighter with the yellows and adding more whites and yellows for the highlights. So hopefully that helps you guys out with some color schemes for highlights and shadows here. I used a lot of green gold in here as well. So for some of these plants, I used a green gold with white for the highlight, and then I used a sap green for the shadow, maybe adding a little bit of sienna in there as well. So just see what colors work for you. If you want to just blend all these colors out for highlights and shadows on your palette first, you could put the highlight in like one little paint dab spot on your palette and then put the shadow below it, and you could see if those colors seem like they work well together. Basically, you just want to keep them on the same like color value range. You don't want to jump too far. Like if you're using lots of warm orange yellows for your highlight, then you don't want to have like a cool green for your shadow, because those two colors wouldn't read properly. That's not what you would see in nature. You would get more, if you have a warm orange, then you would get more browns and purples in your shadows. So just think about that to make your colors read accurately and have fun with it. So now we're continuing to move forward using my liner brush for these little grasses here. We have lots of alizarin crimson in these grasses, and then some ochre mixed with white and a little bit of black to cool it down for the little highlights that are still kind of in shadow. And then I really just thickly lay on some highlights here. And the way I very, very lightly press that brush onto the canvas just to get, you know, the thin little layers of paint on there. If I press more with more force onto the canvas, then I'm going to get a thicker brush stroke mark, and I'm trying to get a little bit more detailed here, so I'm very, very lightly pressing just to get smaller little details on the canvas. And here I'm starting to further build on my shadows and making them darker and building up the contrast to get this super dark foreground, cooler, natural looking tree shadow. You want to use some phthalo green or sap green mixed with phthalo blue and burnt umber, and that'll just give you like the darkest, coolest green shadow that you can get. So I use that for the foreground. That tree right behind the rock on the left is about as dark as we can get, and then I'm going to put a bright highlight over that later, which really helps to create the depth in this painting as well. Starting to use some more dark shadows on the ground, around the rocks and the brush, just building them up more and more. Taking my little liner brush here and starting to create more little grasses that are in the section right in front of that rock. I have a little bit of brush on the grass there too, creating little tick marks. Adding a couple little highlights for some of the brush at the base there. Now I'm starting to add highlights over my dark shadows for this tree here. Using cadmium yellow, maybe a hint of phthalo green, definitely some cadmium yellow medium, maybe a bit of Indian yellow as well. Just trying to really build up these highlights now. And it looks like a really nice cluster of trees and foliage behind that rock. So I'm pretty happy with that. Gonna let that sit for a bit and start to work even closer to the foreground, starting to build up these rocks and make them look more realistic. And we have some greens growing in the little cracks between the rocks here. At first I think I made it look a little too much like just shadows from a bedding plane of the rock, but I went back and I adjusted the highlights and adjusted the shape a bit more, made the little green grassy, mossy section a little thicker, and added a little highlight and a shadow on it to make it look more like it's just some plants growing in the cracks of the rocks. Starting to warm, or not warm, but brighten up my rocks just by adding more white to my colors. That'll just make them lighter. The rocks closest to the foreground are mostly in shadow, as I mentioned before. So before I really come back in those rocks, it looked like I went back for another round of highlights in the middle section there. And now I'm working on another little bit of highlights on those grasses and some highlights on this little bush in the right side in the foreground. So for this, I just take my small flat tip brush to get those little leaves, kind of let the brush dance around and make some little shapes for highlights. And then as we move farther down, I start to add more ultramarine blue to my highlight color. And then as I get to the very bottom of that plant, things get cooler and darker as we keep going down. So I hope that helps you guys with painting your plants in the foreground here. Next, I started to add some of the moss on the rocks really quickly. That is some green gold mixed with some phthalo green and like some browns, a little bit of blacks in there too. You want to mute the color down a little bit, but you want it to be cool in some areas and warm in some areas from a green standpoint. And I keep playing back and forth with what section of rock I want to be exposed rock minerals and what section I want to be covered in that mossy lichen stuff. So you'll see me kind of battle it out with the blues and the greens here. But the greens end up taking over and I end up covering most of that rock with lichen. I ended up not making this like exactly like my reference photograph. Some of these shapes and ridges of the rocks and some of the little divots in the rocks aren't exactly the way they were in my photo, and that was just my own personal choice to make it a little bit more aesthetically pleasing as a painting. So you're welcome to adjust things as well. If you recreate this piece and you want to take away a rock, or you want to add a rock or add a plant to cover up a rock, you know, you have your artistic freedom to do whatever you'd like with this. And this part actually was one of the most frustrating parts of this painting, not because it was difficult, but because it was time consuming. So you guys saw me start working on this in part 3, and then I kind of covered it up. But what you have to do is get the speckled black lichen all over the rock. There's black lichen, there's like a white lichen, like a whitish green lichen, and there's like a cooler green lichen. So you have to get all these different species of lichen on your rock, and you also have to get like a base color for highlights and shadows on the rock. So it sounds pretty complicated, but really it's just like adding specks of black all over the place and not cleaning your brush off so that the black becomes like less dark as you continue to add these little specks, and that'll give you your variety of your dark lichen specks. And you really just make these little specks over and over again all over the rock, and you want to keep them in certain clusters. Like you can see the left side of that little slope in the rock has more black, and then the right side of the slope had more green. So just kind of think about where you're seeing more of a certain type of lichen and add more little dots of paint in that spot. Now moving over to our rock that is in the lower right. This is the first thing that my eye is drawn to when I look at this painting, and so this is a really important rock for your painting. So you want to really have your values right on this rock. You want to have your shadows built up properly. You want to have really dark shadows under that rock, and you want to have a really nice warm highlight at the top of this rock. And you want your lichen to be the right shade of green in your shadow and the right shade of green in your highlight. And the green is like insanely vivid and almost unnatural on that rock, the way that it looked in my reference photo, and I actually kept it looking like that because it may have actually looked like that in real life. I just don't remember. So I went with that color and I was happy with the way it turned out. But just before we get to that, let's continue with where I'm at right now. So we still can, same thing as all the other rocks, we have a cool side and we have a warm side. It's just that this rock has several different layers that are warm from being exposed to the light and several different sections that are cooler blue and shadow. So the parts that are nice and light, I mixed white with a little bit of cadmium red light and like a hint of flesh tint. You could also use like a hint of magenta, a hint of one of your warm yellows, but mostly white because you don't want it to be too vibrant. You want it to be mostly white, just with a little hint of warmth. And then for your shadow, we're using white with some phthalo blue and some ultramarine blue and maybe like a hint of burnt umber or something if you want to mute it down too. But basically everything on the left side of the rock is in shadow, everything on the right side of the rock is exposed to the light. So that's going to work with all of your lichen as well. So we have that same lichen that we have on the rock that I painted before, that big one at the bottom on the ground. So we're going to have the black lichen, the dark green lichen, and like that light sagey green whitish lichen too. So first get your highlight and your shadow for the base kind of color of that rock there. Just start building more on what you already had down. And then start to get your little crevices and try to get the planes of the rock. So anytime there's like a crack, you want to add a little bit more of a shadow in there and a little bit more of a highlight. And once you get those features down and you got the real shape of this rock looking right, then you can start to add all the little detail for the lichens on the rock. And as we're adding our detail for the lichens, everything that's in the warm side is going to be a warmer color for the lichen, and everything on the shadow side is going to be cooler. This rock has so many colors. This rock, like almost every color on my palette was used to paint this rock. I used some sienna in there, as you just saw. We're using our blues, we're using our greens for the lichens, we're using our reds for that warm part of the rock. Yes, yellows too, like literally this is like a rainbow rock. And I really do enjoy painting rocks, especially when they are the focus of the painting and I feel like I'm not wasting my time putting a lot of detail into them. So here's where we have the lichen. So here I ended up using a permanent green deep with a little bit of yellow and white, and that gave me that weird, like, unnatural green that ended up working pretty well. And then so you just use more of that permanent green, or a phthalo green would probably be fine too, with just that and white for the part in shadow, and then for the part in highlight just add some yellow and more white. For that blackish lichen, I mixed some of my ultramarine blue with the black and maybe a little bit of phthalo blue too, just so it was a cooler looking black. And we want to be really, really dark shadow here. You can put as much lichen or as little lichen as you want. You could even make this rock not have any lichen if you really don't want to add all these dots. But if you don't add lichen to this rock, then you shouldn't add lichen to any of the rocks because it's going to be on all of them or on none of them. Alright, so I'm taking a little break from that rock for a second, and it does, like, it's starting to look like that rock is jumping out of the canvas almost, just because of that deep shadow I just put on there. But I'm starting to work back on the right side for a bit, building up that shadow there, because it's not reading fully realistic to me. So I'm kind of tweaking it just a bit to make it look like those ridges are kind of flowing right down into those leaves or dirt or whatever that is right on the right side. Starting to add some more highlights like the whiter lichen in some spots here just by taking my white and blending it on the palette with the color that was on my brush, so it kind of muted that white down a little, not using pure white, but still giving a highlight for that like brighter lichen. Now I'm starting to play with this little shadow that's under this rock. We've got a nice highlight like right on the ridge above the shadow. Got some highlights on that right side of the rock, right above where it folds over to the left side. And at this point, you're kind of just continuing to build up the detail and tweaking features until it feels like it's reading as realistic to you. So it's just a repetitive process of continuing to add more lichen, add more highlights for the bright part of the rock, start to deepen up those shadows, kind of adjust the balance of the lichen, making sure it's looking more realistic. And that basically sums it up, guys. This part of the tutorial starts to get very repetitive, where I'm just continuing to add more detail and adjust highlights and shadows. So I hope you guys enjoyed this painting tutorial. You definitely do not need to go this detailed. I went a little more detailed than I originally thought I was gonna go, but I tend to do that all the time. So I hope you guys had fun with this one, and if you did recreate the painting and you want to share your version of this painting on Instagram, then just tag me, the painting Stoof, so I can see it. Hope you guys have a great day, and I'll catch you next time. Happy painting. Bye bye.